Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of short videos where we look at pre-modern state formations in international relations. In another video, we very briefly looked at other pre-modern state formations and introduced several of the civilizations discussed in Eric Ringmar's Non-Western History of International Relations. In this video, we'll dive into one of those more closely, the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire has the distinction of being the largest land empire in human history, stretching from the Sea of Japan in the east to the Black Sea in the west. The Mongol Empire emerged from the unification of several great competing nomadic groups in Mongolia by Genghis Khan in 1206, and eventually expanded through military conquest to control an area of more than 24 million square kilometers. At its peak in 1294, before fracturing into 4 separate kingdoms as a result of wars over the succession between the grandchildren of Genghis Khan, some 18% of the world's total land area fell under control of the empire. By way of comparison, the Roman Empire, colored in red in this image, reached its peak about the year 100. At that point in time, the Roman Empire spanned some 5 million square kilometers across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. But even at its peak, this was only 20% of the size, or about 1/5 of the area of the controlled by the Khans at the peak of the Mongol Empire in the middle of the 13th century. The Mongol Empire began when Genghis Khan successfully united competing nomadic tribes in what is today Mongolia, and began a series of military campaigns across the Asian steppes. But let's think about the Mongol Empire in the context of statehood and contemporary international diplomacy. Prior to the unification of the Mongols by Genghis Khan, the area of modern-day Mongolia had been ruled over by Liao and the Jin dynasties, which controlled much of modern-day China, Korea, and Mongolia. The Jin practiced a policy of divide and rule, which sought to keep the various nomadic tribes of the Mongolian plateau competing against one another. Genghis Khan, whose given name was Temujin, rose to power to become leader of one of those nomadic tribes, eventually defeating the leader of the most powerful tribe in the region and proclaiming himself Genghis Khan, a title that roughly translates as universal ruler. Khan then launched a series of military conquests that would last the rest of his life. As a political system, the Mongol Empire itself had both progressive and regressive elements. The Mongols boasted a massive military backed primarily by the mobility of their horses. The Mongols' horseback archers and light cavalry could strike quickly and could be redeployed across vast areas very rapidly. But the Mongols preferred to have regions surrender to them based on their fearsome reputation rather than being forced to use the military to conquer territory. Those regions that did surrender were permitted to retain their own religion, culture, and political systems, provided they collected and paid regular tribute, usually in the form of products, gold, silver, and slaves, to the Khan. And in the face of the awesome power and the reputation of the Mongol Empire, many regions did precisely that, simply surrender and pay tribute. But regions which refused to surrender to the Mongol expansion were often subject to massive destruction, slaughter, and in some cases even genocide. The Mongol conquest of the Jin dynasty in China saw hundreds of thousands of troops killed in combat, culminating in the conquest of the Jin's capital, Zhengdu, modern-day Beijing, in 1215. The Mongol conquest of the Kievan Rus in 1235 and the invasion of Hungary in 1239 each resulted in the death of about half of the population of those countries. And following the siege of Baghdad in 1258, the Mongols burned libraries and hospitals, destroyed irrigation systems, and, according to legend, dumped so many books into the Tigris that the river turned black with ink for several days. So widespread was the devastation wrought by the Mongols in Baghdad that the region would not recover until the Middle Ages. But the Mongol Empire was far from all death and destruction. In regions that surrendered to their expansion, ethnic and cultural diversity was appreciated and respected. Regions were permitted to maintain their own political structures, practice their own religions, and maintain their own cultures. The political system used by Genghis Khan brought together councils of leaders and a cabinet of political advisors drawn from the different tribes and nations, all in an effort to understand the specificities of the region under his control. Within Mongolia, the Uyghur script was adopted, official record-keeping began, and literacy expanded. Advancement within the bureaucracy of the Mongolian Empire was based on merit rather than political connections. A fast and efficient mail system permitted the relatively rapid communication within the empire. Diplomacy expanded, and the idea that representatives from other nations should receive safe passage and protection, an early form of diplomatic immunity, was accepted. Interestingly, there was no capital city in the Mongol Empire per se. The capital was always on the move with the Khan. Wherever the Khan was, the capital was. Perhaps of particular interest here is the support the Mongol Empire had for facilitating trade between regions of the empire. The Silk Road, that trade route that emerged between China in the east and Europe in the west as early as the 2nd century BCE, over time connected some of the most famous empires in human history: the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, numerous Chinese dynasties, Turkic tribes, and the Islamic world. But as a trade route, the Silk Road reached its zenith under the Mongol Empire. Indeed, it was during this time that Marco Polo made his famous journey. The Silk Road saw not just trade in precious commodities like silk, jade, and others. It was even, perhaps more importantly, a transmission belt of ideas. Art, religion, philosophy, science, and technology all moved along the Silk Road. So did disease. Indeed, it's believed that the bubonic plague, the disease that caused the Black Death in the middle of the 1300s in Europe and killed between 30 and 60% of the European population over a period of 7 years, traveled from Central Asia to Crimea along the Silk Road. The Black Death led to dramatic changes, massive political, social, and economic upheaval across Europe, setting the stage for the collapse of feudalism and the rise of capitalism, which we discuss in another video. The Mongol Empire collapsed nearly as quickly as it rose. In addition to the political savvy of Genghis Khan, the rise of the empire was attributed, at least in part, to favorable climatic conditions that quickly increased the population of horses on which the empire was so dependent. The collapse of the empire was equally dependent on individual personalities and global events. Dispute between Genghis Khan's grandchildren over the line of succession saw the empire fragment into 4 separate continents. At the same time, the bubonic plague devastated its population base, and changing global weather patterns reduced the food available for both people and horses. The growing power of the Han and Ming dynasties in China and the reemergence of the Russian princes led to growing external challenges, and by the middle of the 14th century, the Mongol Empire had collapsed back in on itself and was no more. So that concludes our consideration of the Mongol Empire. As with the other pre-state formations, it's perhaps interesting to think about what the contemporary world might have looked like had the Mongols or the Chinese dynasties or the Abbasid caliphates or any of the other great civilizations in history had reached their position of dominance that Europe did at the beginning of the modern era. How would political, economic, military, and culture systems have differed? It's an interesting thought experiment. Leave your thoughts below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.